I would like to welcome Professor Roa Garcia to IPROMO course, and I give her the floor. Please.
Thank you very much, Danilo, and thank you everybody for this opportunity to share with you some results of research that we have done at the university. The questions that we will be addressing today relate to what societies are doing with the water flowing down from the mountains in contexts increasingly complex and uncertain. So basically, we're going to be asking ourselves who is using the water and how they are using this water coming down from the mountains. With that in mind, we're going to talk about these two concepts: water metabolism first, and then later we'll address water allocation. So first of all, I would like to talk about the place where I come from. I am an assistant professor at Universidad de los Andes at 2,600 meters in elevation. And here on the right, you see a picture of the campus. And also I wanted to tell you a little bit about my PhD work with Hans Schreier, the professor who gave you very interesting talks at the beginning of the course. I did my PhD with him, and this is a picture of a visit we did to the Santa Isabel Glacier in 2004 when we were trying to link my PhD field research to other sites in the mountains of the Andes. Right now, I work mostly on environmental democracy, water governance, and extractive frontiers. So what I'm going to talk to you about right now is about this concept of water metabolism, growing demand of water, and uncertainty in extractive frontiers. And this is the result of, or this is the summary of a paper that was just accepted to be published in the journal Water International, with the title Producing Energy Depleting Water, the Energy Sector as a Driver of Seasonal Water Scarcity in an Extractive Frontier of the Upper Orinoco Watershed in Colombia. So this study, what it does is it tries to figure out what we are doing with the water that flows down from the Andes into the Great Orinoco Basin. So the objectives, the learning objectives of this talk will be to become familiar with the concepts of social metabolism and water metabolism, and recognize opportunities and challenges associated with these two concepts and their applications. We start with this diagram that most of us will be familiar with, which is a diagram of our own body metabolism. And we'll use this this idea of metabolism applied in a different scale. So we're going to start with the context in which we're going to use these two concepts. Then I will talk about the general concept of social metabolism, its components, and an application of the concept at the global scale. Then we're going to move into water metabolism with a case study from an extractive frontier in Colombia, and then we will identify challenges and opportunities, and we'll have a plenary for summary and reflections. So let's start with the context of conflict. Conflict is one of the manifestations of an accelerated social metabolism. This group, based in the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, has put together the Environmental Justice Atlas that I think you have seen in previous lectures in the course. And this recent paper published in last year put together a diagnosis of the main sources of conflict. And we find that water management comprises 14% 14% of social environmental conflicts worldwide, although most conflicts related to mining energy and biomass, we could say that they are indirectly related to water as well. It is important to see also shown in this paper that 13% of global socio-environmental conflicts have resulted in at least one assassination of an environmental defender. And we see that water-related conflicts have a high incidence as well of this type of violence. I put together a table for the countries from which the participants of this course come from. And we see very interesting cases of percentages of water-related conflicts higher than the average for the globe. So we see here, for example, well, India, Myanmar, also Nepal, Pakistan, Peru, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, that have very high percentages of water-related conflicts. So why do we talk about extractive frontiers? Conflicts concentrate in extractive frontiers, defined as regions where economic processes linked to the consumption, depletion, and appropriation of natural resources are concentrating and expanding, and also defined as places where biophysical and social factors come together, leading to geographies of uncertainty and risk for the people who depend on these local resources. The concept of extractive frontier has been very useful to understand the way societies relate to nature. So this is where the concept of social metabolism comes into play. So we remember the picture of the human metabolism. So when we move that diagram to the scale of society, the social metabolism is defined as the way human societies organize exchanges of energy and materials with the environment. It begins when socially organized human beings appropriate materials and energies from nature. So that's the input, and ends when they deposit waste output like emissions, residues in natural spaces. But between these two phenomena, there are also processes in the guts of society through which the appropriated energies and materials circulate, are transformed, and end up being consumed. So the metabolic process is represented by these 5 distinguishable phenomena. The appropriation, which is the primary form of exchange between human societies and nature. Then we have transformation processes that imply changes that are produced on the materials that have been extracted from nature and that are no longer consumed in the original form. They're transformed. T as along historical process, transformation has become a more complex activity as the process has become less labor intensive and more energy intensive. It has shifted from craftsmanship to manufacturing, and we get ever more elaborate and complex products. This chain of transformations often make raw materials no longer distinguishable, right? They get fully transformed. And then we have the process of circulation that, just like transformation in the course of history, have become more complex. The volumes of what circulates is increasing, as well as the distances that materials and energy travel. And then we have the process of excretion, which is the act by which society throws material and energy into nature, including waste, fumes, gases, substances, and heat. And about excretion, there are 2 main questions to consider. One is the quality of the waste, whether or not it is recyclable by nature, and its quantity, whether or not it exceeds the natural capacity to receive and process those outputs. And this is in addition to heat, how nature deals with this increased temperature. So there are three fields of the study of social metabolism: the rural metabolism, urban metabolism, and industrial metabolism. And each of them focuses or concentrates in one particular or two specific metabolic processes. So we see, for example, the rural metabolism focuses on appropriation because it's more linked to extraction. Urban metabolism focuses mostly on consumption and excretion. And industrial metabolism concentrates mainly on transformation and also on excretion. So where do we get this idea, or how did we start using the concept of metabolism, which comes from biophysical sciences, in the social sciences? From Marx's reading of Darwin, he derived a key concept that allowed him to build the critical theory he developed on capitalism, which is this concept of the Stoffwechsel, which means organic exchange or metabolism. And he used this concept in two senses. First, as an analogy or a biological metaphor to illustrate the circulation of goods in society, or as an exchange between man and land. That's the way he called it, or an exchange between society and nature. Most analyses of social metabolism have concentrated just on quantifying the energy and material flows between nature and society. So this concept of social metabolism is, as Victor Toledo, who was an environmental minister in Mexico, he said social metabolism is a concept that is perhaps the most powerful theoretical instrument for analyzing the relationships between natural and social processes. And this is particularly useful these days when we're seeing that natural and social processes are articulated in an unprecedented way, generating new dynamics, increasing complexity, and unpredictable and surprising synergies. So we have basically worldwide about 5 different groups of researchers. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to. Apologies. 5 different groups around the globe who have done research on social metabolism. We have the Vienna group. We're going to see one example of the Vienna group. The Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, which takes another approach, which is the one I will be applying to the case study, and 3 other labs. Another one at the University of Barcelona, another one in the Lab of History and Agroecosystems of the University Pablo de Olavide in Seville, and the same Victor Toledo from Mexico, who has been using a theoretical and applied approach to the rural dimension of social metabolism. So we're going to talk first. I'm going to show you this example from the Vienna group. This is a paper published in 2018 in Global Environmental Change, called From Resource Extraction to Outflows of Wastes and Emissions, the Socioeconomic Metabolism of the Global Economy in a Historical Perspective from 1900 to 2015. And This study is extremely interesting, and basically what they did was to put together these very summarized or condensed diagrams showing, for example, in this case, the accumulated global extraction of biomass, which is the green flow, the fossil fuels, the orange, and ores and minerals, the gray, from 1900 to 2015, and their transformation into net additional stocks, and also the outputs in the forms of water vapor, the blue flows, emissions, which is the dark gray, and solid liquid waste, the brown, all measured in gigatons. We note here that the net addition to stock of humans and livestock, which amounts to about 1 gigaton, does not show in the graph because it is negligible in comparison to the other flows of the diagram. What they found analyzing the social metabolism in this historical perspective is that the size of society's metabolism has multiplied since 1900. There has been a massive draw of material resources and the corresponding outflows and wastes and emissions. The biophysical flow has been speeding up significantly since the 21st century. The growth rates of material flows are comparable these days to the decades after the World War II, which was considered the great acceleration historically, the great acceleration of economic acceleration. So another thing they noted is that about 1/3 of all the materials that have been extracted or disposed of since 1900 have been mobilized between 2002 and 2015 alone. So this gives us an idea of how accelerated the metabolism is currently. There is currently no agreement as to what can be considered sustainable, like a sustainable level of global material extraction. But there is an agreement that such a sharp increase in the last few years clearly exceeds the level of 100 gigatons per year, which is considered potentially sustainable. Another way of looking at this is this other graph that they put together, the same group, and published in the same paper. With the historical social metabolism, they projected global extraction per capita. So they took extraction in historical perspective since 1900, which is the blue continuous line here, and created a scenario of global extraction until 2050, which is the dotted red line over here. The scenario, in order to come to this scenario, what they did was they assumed a convergence of food patterns and per capita stocks of manufactured capital to the 2010 level of industrialized countries by 2050, a continuation of past trends in energy and material efficiency, and a growth in world population to 9.1 billion. So basically what they're doing is they warning us that in order to transition to a sustainable path, there should be a continuous and considerable reduction material flows in industrialized countries, as these countries continue to appropriate disproportionately more of the key materials extracted globally. But also they say that the global south should move to a less material intensive provision of essential services, because economic development in these countries is a driving force behind the recent rise in global extraction. They also say that it will not be enough with incremental change and moderate efficiency gains, such as those that we have achieved in the past to compensate the demand arising in the global south. So now I would like to ask you as a group or in your groups, how do you think that we can apply this concept of the social metabolism to water? What would it look like? What are the challenges and what would be the advantages of applying this concept of social metabolism to water? Is there any way that we could go splitting into our groups and discuss these questions for 5 to 10 minutes? Or would you prefer to do it in plenary?
I guess we don't have the tool for splitting in 4 separate chat rooms. But if you I'm sorry for that, but I'm not sure that it is feasible. So if is it okay for you, I would like to stop the lecture for, let's say, 3 minutes, so participants can also chat, maybe using the chat tool, and then after this 3 or 5 minutes, is up to you. They can give the answer that you are requesting. What do you think?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. That's great.
Okay,
that's
so
great. Let's take 5 minutes and then let's come back to plenary.
Okay, great.
On how we might apply the concept of social metabolism to water. Patricia?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Here I am. Where I am. Oh God. I don't know if you can hear me even.
We can hear you.
Oh, sorry. It's because I was looking for my window. I'm sorry. I just joined now, like 2 minutes ago, while you were on a pause, because I was finishing a document. If not,
don't worry.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm so bad with all this. I have too many windows open. Sorry.
Does anybody want to share with us some ideas on how we would be able to apply the concept of social metabolism to water?
This is Piyush, and I'm happy to share some very conceptual ideas. And I'm not really sure whether I respond specifically to social metabolism, but let's see how it goes. So I'm looking at a town or a city called Shimla in Himachal Pradesh in the Indian Himalayas. Other than being the capital city of the state, it's also an important tourist center, and there is a massive tourist inflow, especially during summers, from the plains of India, which basically is Delhi and its surroundings. Now, traditionally, Shimla has relied on water sources that are tapped upstream of Shimla. And a quick search on the internet says that it had a total availability of something like 38 million liters per day till quite recently. The challenge, of course, being that it's a combination of snow melt and rainfall, and in a dry year, the availability goes down. I understand that post a crisis in the summers of 2018, the water source has been augmented by about 10 million liters per day. So it's now in the range of 50 MLD. Now, this is the scenario. What I am proposing, or what I'm thinking, is that if you look at the average rainy days per month in Shimla, it's actually quite well spread over the entire year, except maybe the months of November and December, where they just have 3 rainy days per month. But otherwise, it ranges from 6 days to 20 days. So if we were to take a rooftop rainwater harvesting approach, where we create a decentralized storage, virtually one for every building, it's quite likely that a significant amount of water requirements, maybe for secondary use, if not primary use, could be fulfilled by the rain that falls on the rooftop of the building itself. Now, interestingly, one of the most renowned buildings in Shimla, which currently has become a center for research and was originally the governor's bungalow and was built during the British colonial period, has a rainwater harvesting tank built, I don't know, maybe 150 years back, and it's still operational. So it's not that it's a new idea. It's been successfully implemented in the past. Whereas I guess now we rely more on large schemes of augmenting water supply without actually seeing what is potentially possible at the household level. So this is briefly what I thought of. Thank you.
Okay, that's a great example. It's very exciting to see how you already took so many ideas from the concept of social metabolism, and how many different perspectives you could or approaches you could use to study water metabolism. I would ask you, what do you think are the challenges to apply the concept of water metabolism to Shimla?
So for the particular solution of sorts of rooftop rainwater harvesting, one is that people don't understand it, including people in the development sector or civil engineers. It's still something that people are not able to completely visualize. So one is, it would be important to help them visualize this. There would have to be a sort of policy level incentive for people to implement a program like this. I feel the approach would be that of maybe pilots or wherein people can actually see this over a season maybe. And when they actually see that certain families are relatively well off in the crisis period is when people are going to get convinced. And I think there'll also have to be a skilling exercise where you work with the plumbers and the petty contractors of Shimla who typically take up the smaller works and train them in doing this. Thanks.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. It's very interesting. We're going to see some similarities to what you have proposed in this discussion. Any other ideas or any other examples that you, yes?
I add? Hi, this is Anuradha. Can I add something into Piyush's comment?
Absolutely.
I live in Shimla, and Piyush is correct that all the buildings, like mostly government buildings which are built in British era, the rainwater harvesting works properly. But like in current situation, it is legally all the house owners, they need to build this water harvesting tank. They are building also, but exactly what people are doing, these tanks are not functional. Like I built is for the sake of building, and then I put it in the paper, but actually these tanks are not working, like not even in a single building. So I live in this city from past 17 years. So even I have not seen even one functional this water tank harvesting is done by any house owner, because they don't want to invest in the all these water lifting systems. They just rely on the water which is provided by the government, like water supply system. And like what happened 3 years ago, it was like due to less rain and due to less snowfall, so we were out of water for 1 week. And still, like we are not going towards this, we are not taking it seriously, this water harvesting. Obviously it is a great idea, we should do it, but like we are not doing it. So that is the current scenario here in this hill city. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anuradha. It's very good to hear how, you know, some great ideas, when applied, they don't really work, right? But when we look at the water metabolism concept, we're going to see how we can take information to make things visible, to help people understand what's really happening on the ground. So we're gonna, unless there's any other person who would like to share some idea, some other perspective, some other thought about challenges and advantages of the concept of social metabolism to water. Anyone?
Maybe I can just add a few points to what Anuradha and Piyush just mentioned about
Yes, go
rainwater
ahead.
harvesting. This is one area we essentially work for last few years now, and in fact we have also devised a new design of rainwater harvesting that's primarily meant for aquifer recharge. The biggest challenge that we see, and that is applicable to most cities here, is not just in the mountain areas but also in the plains. Despite it is being a mandatory exercise now, it's been made mandatory by the government to have rainwater structures in residential high-rise apartment buildings as well as the institutional buildings. But it is like Anuradha said, it is only being done on the paper. It is more like a greenwash, but none of them are functional because of various reasons. Because one, they realize that this is a one-time exercise. Afterwards, nobody's going to come and inspect it whether this is functional. And the other challenge that we see is also that it requires the technicians, the technical persons who are supposed to build this. They require certain expertise and skill sets to make an efficient rainwater harvesting system, and that lacks. We carried out a skill development exercise a few years ago in one of the states of further in the southern India, and we realized that this can have, if we start skilling those people who are at the helm of constructing these, so it will have more impact. One, of course, we will have to, in any case, have larger policy change, and we'll have to also stringent enforcement system. But skilling those people who are supposed to implement this is another area that requires attention. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pranab. So I see one very interesting thing that you all, the three of you, Piyush, Anuradha, and Pranab, talked about, which is the issue of scale. Piyush took us to the scale of the city, right? He took us to Shimla. He took us there and he made us see a problem at the city scale. Then Anuradha took us to the neighborhood, the household scale to tell us this is not necessarily working. And then Pranab took us again to the city and say, well, wait a second, we need the capacity. We need to understand how these systems work and how we need expertise, right, to make it work. So now we're going to move into the application of social metabolism to water. And we're going to look at how this visualization of water metabolism at very different scales can help us understand what's going on with the way societies, groups, human groups, families, cities, watersheds, regions are using water. So let's look at this diagram, which would be, remember the application, this very first diagram we saw of the human metabolism. And if we apply it to water, it would be something like this. We would have water at the center, the available water, with inputs which come from the environment. And we need to ask ourselves, how much water do we have? And how much water is needed for ecosystems to function? Because we depend on the health of ecosystems to live as well. So then we have how we use water, how societies are using water, what is being done with water, and how much water is left. And also we need to ask ourselves how much water is degraded and no longer suitable for use. So this is the way we are going to translate the social metabolism into water. We then can move to these terms that you have seen already in previous lectures, which is the concept of the water footprint in different colors. So we have the blue water, which is the water that we withdraw for irrigation and household use, for example, from rivers, from groundwater, from aquifers. Then we have green water, which is taken up by crops and transpired back into the atmosphere. And then we have gray water, which is the water that we use that we use to excrete, to deposit our wastes and emissions, which is the water that is used to dilute pollution. When we transfer these concepts into the hierarchical multi-level framework of water metabolism, more or less we're going to have something like this. We're going to see, we're going to build a framework. We're going to quantify how much water we have in our funds, in our ecological funds, like how much water, like what Piyush told us for Shimla, how much water it rains, how much water it melts in a certain area or for a certain region or for a certain city. And then on the right-hand side, we're going to see how we use that water. So the water metabolism distinguishes between hydrological and social drivers. The hydrological would be here, and the social drivers of water scarcity. And it incorporates the rate of extraction as well as the capacity to provide environmental flows. So this is more or less the way water metabolism is structured. We have water used by society on the right-hand side and water for ecosystems or water coming from ecosystems on the left-hand side. And we see here the surface, blue water, green water, and blue water on the left-hand side, and consumption, production of water for the economy. Also on the left-hand side, the main original water sources, and then the final uses of water. So this is, keep in mind this flow because we're gonna see it later when we apply the concept to our case study. So now we're gonna move into an application of water metabolism in an extractive frontier. And that's the reason why I was asking you to imagine what could be the opportunities? What could water metabolism help us visualize? And this is what we came, we arrived to. We think that water metabolism helps us get insights on the impacts of territorial transformation and the relative contribution of multiple water uses in a region, in a city, in a community. Through the integration of water, agricultural, and energy sectors, water metabolism represents the water-food energy nexus and allows for an integrated analysis across multiple spatial and temporal scales. And this is also something that came up in the discussion we had previously, when Piyush told us that it's very different when we consider dry months or the whole year. When we consider the whole year, we might have a whole lot of rain, but if we consider the dry season, particularly in tropical areas, it might be a very different story. Also, water metabolism has the potential to highlight water use patterns underlying water-related conflicts. Remember that we're talking about regions of the world where water conflicts are increasing. And this tool has the potential to let us see patterns that are creating or causing this water-related conflicts. So now we're going to go, I'm going to take you to our study site. This is the Metica River watershed. As you can see in the map, on the right-hand side, it is located on the headwaters of the Great Orinoco Basin. The Metica watershed is a little bit under 4,000 square kilometers. And the Greater Orinoco Basin, which you see here, is at the north of the Amazon Basin. It's just the Amazon is right here. The Greater Orinoco Basin has basically three river systems. The mountain streams, which descend from the eastern cordillera of the Colombian Andes, which are these mountains that you see here. The hillside streams of the upper plains and the slow-flowing rivers over here that are fed by swamps in very vast savanna flatlands. The headwaters of the Orinoco Basin in Colombia have become one of the fastest growing economic frontiers in South America. The extractive activities in this region include oil, gas, gravel extraction, large-scale agricultural production of oil, palm oil, and cattle, and they all compete with peasant agriculture, artisanal fishing, and domestic water use. And I'm sure this is not a very foreign scenario to you, because you come from countries that are facing identical transformations. So what is happening in this region is that superficial water bodies, such as lakes, swamps, and slow-flowing headwater streams, are being diverted and drained before they are even mapped and studied for their hydrological and biological importance. Additionally, hydrological knowledge of this region is very scarce, which is also most likely very common in your countries. And environmental licenses for a very broad range of activities are approved with limited information about the complex hydrological dynamics of these headwaters. So this is again a map of the Metica River with the meteorological stations that were available. The study area is, of course, located in the tropics, so we don't have seasons, but we have, like most of you, wet and dry seasons. Precipitation is between 3,000 and 5,000 millimeters per year, but just like in Shimla, the region is characterized by a dry season, which goes from September through January, and an intense wet season from February through August. During the dry season, precipitation can be between 0 and 40 millimeters per month. This range is not uncommon. So the resulting variability in precipitation and stream flow, together with a history of social conflicts and the economic dynamics of extractive frontiers, converge, creating the conditions for conflicts around water. So we see here that these conflicts are typical within the study area. We see, for example, here you can see in the land use map of 2014, very large areas used for oil plantations, the yellow areas in the map, as well as grasslands for livestock grazing, which is the light green areas in the map, as well as environmental licenses granted for the operation of oil fields, which are the black polygons that you see, like here, here, and these that are not very clear, but those are also oil fields. Extractive activities and large-scale agriculture have also created employment and attracted migrants from other parts of the country. So all these trends are competing interests and create a lot of stress on ecosystem functioning due to the growing water needs, transforming the hydrological dynamics of the rivers and wetlands, and generating irreversible loss of biodiversity. One water use that I would like to tell you about before we move forward is the one that is generating a significant impact, which is the oil production water that I highlight here. So oil production water is the water that results as a byproduct of oil extraction, and it includes the water that is injected into reservoirs, the oil reservoirs, to push oil to the production well. This is about 10 liters of production water per liter of oil that is extracted, but the proportion of production water increases with the age of the well, reaching up to 98% of water used in nearly depleted oil fields. So as the oil fields become older, they need more and more water to push the oil up to the surface. Production water usually is a very complex substance, including a mixture of dissolved and particular organic and inorganic chemicals, which depend on the geographical location of the oil field, the geological and geochemical properties, extraction methods, and the type of hydrocarbon that is being extracted. And all these factors influence the characteristics of the production water. But major properties of this water include heavy metals, salinity, conductivity, oil grease content, total petroleum-based hydrocarbon content, and chemical additives that are used during the operation of the well. So this is just to highlight one of the uses that, that water has in the watershed. So let's see how we calculated the water metabolism. One of the things that I wanted you to think about when I asked you about the challenges was how we get data, because we live in countries where data is scarce, it's difficult to get, or when the data exists, is not available for the public. So I wanted you to think about, and I still want you to think about, how would you come about building your own water metabolism in your city, in your watershed, when you have limited data availability? So this is what we came up with. I'm not going to go into a lot of details of the data gathering for inputs, but I will just say that we had data from only one hydrological station at the outflow of the Metica River, and we had precipitation data for 7 meteorological stations that I showed you in a previous map to estimate available surface water supply. What was more challenging was to get data for societal use of water. So our first estimates came from allocation data. That is the information about the formal institutional distribution of water by environmental authorities to users that request that water or they request water use permits. So that was the first data that we had available. However, this data on water allocation did not match what the people on the ground were telling us in the fields. So we decided to start using proxies to get a closer approximation to actual water use. So for example, for palm oil, we had water allocation data, but we also used the area of production based on the maps and crop water requirements. For hydrocarbons, we had water allocation data, as you can see here from the dotted line, but we also we calculated water use according to the literature on the water use per barrel that is needed to extract oil per day. For livestock, we used the agricultural census data on cattle. For household use, we used population projections. And for rice and small scale farms, we used the same as in palm oil. And for gray water, we used the pollutant concentrations from discharge and stream flow to calculate gray water footprint. This is the first results of water use data based on our different data sources. So you see that here, only using the allocation data, we got very small amounts of water used. We had to move into proxies for blue water, diverted water use from the streams, and then with using proxies for gray water use, we got the appropriated water use, and then we added green water estimations to get a closer approximation to how water is being used in the watershed. These graphs show a comparison between water use with availability. This is a first approximation. So the first thing we wanted to look at was the difference between the annual scale and the monthly scale, since there are such prolonged dry seasons. In a year of average precipitation, these two graphs here show the year situation. So in a year of average precipitation, this is more or less the amount of water that would be available in a year. And if we compare that to the blue and gray water that is allocated, we see that there's a lot of available water. Also, if we consider blue and gray water using proxies, similar situation we get in a dry year. But if we move into a dry month of an average year, this is the situation we get. We have the blue and gray water using proxies, not just the water that is allocated. We get a full allocation over the amount of available water. And the situation, of course, is much worse if we consider a dry year of a dry month. Okay, and now let's look at the actual water metabolism after we organized all that data. Remember the first diagram, the schematic I showed you a few slides away. And here what we see is the primary inflow, which is the black arrows that you see here. This is the available water, available surface water supply that is going to be used as blue water and gray water, right? And that is going to be used in households, in the formal economy, and in the formal economy, we're going to see it transformed into agriculture, industry, tourism, and energy. And we see here, as the key takeaway of this whole graph, that the energy sector, mainly palm oil, as we can see here, takes up most of gross water use, but there's still a lot of available water, as we saw from the previous graph, because we are here at the annual scale. But then let's move into the water metabolism at the monthly scale. And this is what we get. The funds of water represented in the black arrows are much thinner than at the annual scale, as you see here. And the flows of water into society are very similar that at the annual scale, but the difference here is that the available water is fully allocated during the dry months. Palm oil is diverting most of the blue water, and hydrocarbons contribute to the bulk of degraded water. So just like the Vienna group, we wanted to create different scenarios at different temporal scales. So we started with the best case scenario at the annual scale. And this is what we get. So the yellow squares represent the available surface water. Each little square represents 100 million square meters of water. The light blue squares correspond to the ecological flows that should be left in the stream to maintain ecological functions. Blue and gray squares represent the appropriated water by society. So the best scenario at the annual scale would be a wet year and a water use corresponding only to water allocation. Not using proxies, only the water that is allocated by environmental authorities. What would happen during a dry year? If we get a dry year at the annual scale, we would see lower precipitation, so less non-appropriate, so we would get less surface water available for allocation. Then we would get, in the worst case scenario, we would get more water use using proxies. So we would have less non-appropriated water left in the streams. But if we move to the monthly scale, a best case scenario would be a wet year, also with water use equivalent to the water allocated by environmental authorities. In this scenario, what we basically have is that we only get ecological flows left in the streams, right? If we project a scenario of a dry month in a dry year and water used based on proxies, what we get is a scenario of full allocation of stream flow. In the worst case scenario, if we take the worst case scenario and we break down the diverted and degraded water for a dry month, this is what we would see. We would see that the formal economy, particularly the energy sector and the palm oil sector, are the main drivers of scarcity. So consider, for example, diverted water. So we see that most of the water goes to the formal economy, most of it goes to energy, and most of it goes to irrigating oil palm. And if we take degraded water, we see that most of the water is used to, the rivers are used as recipients of production water from the hydrocarbon extraction. And this is, well, this is very interesting that is still happening, because this practice of disposing production water into rivers is an activity that has been banned in many other countries already. So I would like you to think about, based on what you have seen, what can we conclude about water metabolism? How do you think you could apply this tool, this concept in your watersheds, in your cities, in your regions? And also, based on this example, what reflections do you get? What thoughts come to your mind? Maybe we can take also 3 minutes to think about it and come back to plenary and have a discussion.
the palm oil plantations are located in a region which has fairly high rainfall for most of the year, and some rainfall even in the dry months. So to a certain extent, I would think that the water that falls there would also address irrigation needs. And so, unless I'm not able to visualize this properly, is there a proper sort of irrigation done, or does it rely primarily on rainfall? Is it rain-fed or is it irrigated?
Both. So both. So during, as you said, during the rainy season, there's no need for irrigation. Irrigation is only needed during the dry season. But what happens is that during the wet season, because it's so wet, the growers need to drain the fields so that the water doesn't stagnate and damage the crop. So that's one of the process they have to induce in the fields. But then in the dry season, because it can be so dry, then they need to irrigate and withdraw all that blue water from the streams. So you get both extremes. What does it make you think? What does this exercise of water metabolism make you think about? How can we start to synthesize what we just saw?
Well, I feel that I'm speaking all the time, but if there's nobody else, I'm happy to share some ideas. Okay. So one is, I felt that it helps us visualize certain things that are difficult to see, but at the same time, it remains quite complex and complicated, and may require some further simplification for people to really understand. And these could be people within the industry, and these could also be common people, or even people in the government. That is one thing. I also felt that at some stage, to me, it seems like this helps us look at the problems, and the problems seem insurmountable. So if somewhere, maybe as a continuation of this, one can also move towards solutions. Because maybe solutions are not so easy to put in place, but I think that sort of helps people to move in that certain direction. And I just have an idea, but I'm going to quickly show it to you. So I was drawing a little, I don't know if it's visible. You can see I've tried to draw the basin that you shared with us, Metica.
Yeah.
And to me, it looks like a bird with the top like a little head. And I was just thinking that it could be interesting to visualize the same basin differently, and then use that to talk of the flows and help people visualize. And you could link it to biodiversity, you could link it to a certain rare bird, endemic bird that's found in the area, or to the magnificent bird diversity of Colombia, and use something like that, which is more relatable to talk about the basin. Thanks.
Thank you. That makes me think about the way we actually came up with with our conclusions, because we had this idea that we wanted to apply water metabolism at the Metica watershed, and we collected the data, we did the diagrams and everything. And then when we had our preliminary results, we did this workshop that you see in the picture with the local people. And we said, okay, help us understand what the numbers and all this. And it was so interesting. And I'm going to show you in the other slides that I have some pictures of that workshop, because that's exactly what we did. We looked at the watershed and we said to them, okay, show us where this conflict is happening, where this water scarcity is more evident, where this problem is more evident, and the conclusions were actually came up from them. You know, we just provided some numbers, we provided the space, but they were the ones who told us how we could interpret this data and these results. And for example, one thing that came up very, very clearly from this exercise: palm oil is classified by the environmental authorities as agriculture, because it's a crop. But for the local people, it shouldn't be classified as agriculture. It should be classified as energy, as in the energy sector. That's why we moved palm oil to the energy sector, because it's a frontier, it's a region that is transforming water into energy. And that's how we constructed the narrative with the local people. So yeah, what Piyush is telling us is very important. You know, it's that you do these exercises, you have certain tools available to quantify, to illustrate, but the analysis has to be done by the people who can really understand, because they live there and they're experiencing these conflicts themselves. Any other reflection?
Hi, could I just come in? I'm not a water, scientist, or, I come from a social science background and primarily in the development field. But the way I reflect, and this is a critical reflections, not only in regards to the water metabolism, but development practice in general, that is informed by science, right? Rigorous scientific exercise, something like this, which you've already done in regards to how can you, the whole idea of calculating a water metabolism under that nested hierarchy is really appreciating the complex nature of the pressure that water system is facing for economic use for various reasons, right? And this applies to any resource, whether it's food, whether it's water. Now, the question that really hits us hard in relation to now, what does this mean, right? So in regards to the sort of the rigorous scientific research that went on, yes, it is collaborative, because a lot of the solutions, as you said, was suggested by local. But then, it's all about this operationalizing this concept, or the rigorous scientific endeavor in a more practical sense. Means, like, I wonder how many years it took to have these findings. But if you want to overlay this in the context of the development time frame, if you're collaborating with the local, politicians, or or even regional, they have 5 years, the electoral whatever, the mandates for them to present an impact, right? Is they have a limited, and when we are we cannot take shortcut for an exercise like this, because otherwise we will not be able to understand the complexity and also really understand where things should be changed, right? So, and this is not only what you are presenting, it cuts across all the, any kind of evidence-based policy interventions or development that you want to make. It does have that limitation. So how do we ensure that we can bridge this gap? Because this is, again, I was asking last time also when Professor, forgot her name, from, regarding this IPCC report, special report, on 1.5 degree and mountain, is that scientific communities are doing great, right? There's quite a lot of revelations happening, but there is always this lag behind, when we are trying to really, because it matters at the community level or at wherever level that we are, in this case, watershed level. So I wanted to really understand, how can we break this cycle? Like, how do we ensure that this can be, yeah. Sorry, I'm not trying to be very critical, but this is generic across all, right? And we struggle because we want to bring change, you know, and we keep on talking about transformative change, but transformative change does require this sort of a rigorous scientific analysis and exercises, because our risks are becoming more complex. Our needs is also becoming much and more intertwined with different sectors. So how do we bring change given all this, you know? I don't know how to say forward, but this is what I'm feeling after listening to you.
Wow, it's a very interesting discussion where you're proposing, Anu, and I think it's also a very difficult one. But I think you know, taking your question as how do we break that cycle, I think it's by democratizing science and democratizing knowledge and helping people own this science, own this information, so that they can go after those authorities that are allowing certain things to happen. So at least that's the way, that's the approach we're having, right? We're saying, okay, we came up with this. This is for the communities. The communities should own this information. And for example, now with neighbor catchment, which is the Guayuriba River, we're seeing that people are demanding a different approach to the river. We're seeing that people are saying, hey, the production water shouldn't be discharged on these rivers. These rivers are being sacrificed for the oil industry, and this shouldn't happen. There are other rivers that, like the Metica River, that where we have information that this is happening, and we don't want this to happen to other rivers. So I think that's you know, sharing and helping people appropriate this knowledge is the way to go. But I think it's like as you say, it's a very long process. It takes a lot of it has taken a lot of time. And as you said, this process too take us, as you see here in the picture, this was before the pandemic. We did this workshop in 2018, you know, already 3 years ago. And it took us a while to get all this data organized and yeah, synthesized as you see it here. Okay, we're gonna move into some of my reflections, and please feel free to interrupt if you have any other thoughts about it, or you want to contribute a little bit more on these reflections. So the first, you know, conclusions that we get is that we're getting, with conservative estimates, that 40% of available surface water supply is being diverted in the dry season, but more realistic estimates suggest that appropriation of the entire surface water supply in the dry season is happening. That those requirements that are beyond the capacity of rivers are plausibly being met by withdrawals from aquifers, from groundwater, which is not foreign to any of us. The scenarios of the dry season depict an unsustainable rate of water use, a governance system that is complacent with the high demands of the extractive sector, and represent the driving force of the ecological transformation of the Orinoco Basin. We also see that the hydrocarbon sector has the greatest impact on water degradation, especially during the dry season, because rivers are being used as the sinks for oil production water. Although this degraded water was calculated based on licensed discharges, so discharges that have permits, and the maximum permissible biological oxygen demand concentrations, we have some evidence that there are cases of mismanagement. So, you know, the companies, the corporations discharge way more water than they are allowed, which would result in actually a larger gray water footprint than we estimated. In terms of blue water use, palm oil is the sector that has the greatest impact, both annually and monthly. And these two sectors are responsible for water scarcity during the dry season. Even in situations of very complex hydrology with limited knowledge of water availability and limited use of data by environmental authorities, we think that the water metabolism allows us to generate scenarios that reflect the high risk of water depletion posed by the energy sector. And we're sure that this is applicable elsewhere. And about the water metabolism, we see it as a way of assessing the integrated effects of water quantity and quality in data poor settings. We saw that it was possible to apply water metabolism even without having the exact data. We saw it as a versatile tool to geographically display and analyze interactions between water and society. We were able to systematize concerns of the small water users in the watershed, and we were able to graphically demonstrate the risks of excessive water use by the extractive sector. And these are the pictures that I was telling you about. These are some of the references that I mentioned in the presentation. And if you're interested in more readings about other applications of water metabolism, these are some suggestions. There are some studies that have been done in the Punjab region in India, in Spain, and in Ecuador, and in other countries that the water metabolism has been applied with different angles and different approaches. Yeah, so I would be very happy to hear your ideas on how to apply water metabolism, or even about further conclusions that we might have not seen with this analysis.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I hear you.
Hi, this is Claudia from Peru. For me, it was really interesting to hear the whole concept and how it is applied. It made me think in different scenarios where I have worked. I have worked in coastal areas where groundwater is being extracted for monocultures. And it made me think you have the appropriation of the water in that case, and how it becomes virtual water in the production. But also how in the transformation you have a really important role of workers, that are affected by flexible labor conditions because of promoting the monocultures. So I was wondering how these aspects are involved in part of this metabolism, right? Especially if we consider the social aspects. No? And I have also worked in the Amazonia, so when you talk about all the pollution, it also made me think in the complexities, right? Because there are also oil spills in the areas where I have worked, and the main discourse of the companies is that it's not affecting people, because if you see that the oil is gone from some months after the spill, they say, no, it's not that bad, or it's not affecting them really, no? So I think these approaches that help us to see the whole picture and to hear also the population point of view are really important also against these main discourses that are being created. Even now I have some, I noticed the challenges related to data, but I at least for me, it was really inspiring to start thinking about how we can see this context from this point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And you made me realize something that I missed in the presentation, which is that some other applications of the water metabolism that have been done in other areas include, for example, transforming water into income. Say, for example, because you see here that we use the approach of how water was transformed into, say, oil or into palm oil, right? But there are regions where, or approaches simply, where you can see, okay, how much of this economic activity using water generated income for people, right? How much labor was involved. So how much this water helped generate income for migrant populations, for example. And this is also something that is feasible. We can do it. You know, we can show, okay, some of it is environmental impact, but some of it is also an economic gain. And yeah, that's it's also a very feasible approach, or you know, a complementary approach. Any other parts of the country? Yeah, Claudia, go ahead.
No, I was only going to say thank you, and that also makes me think about how to include this labor and energy aspects, and who is gaining the profit, right? The workers, the companies.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly. Who do you want to use? Who wants to use the water metabolism framework? Right. You can tailor it for the user. Yeah, I would like to hear from other parts of the planet. I'm so excited to have a group with people from so many different countries. Anyone from Africa who would like to share? There's somebody from Lesotho, there's somebody from Uganda. From Saudi Arabia. Okay, I guess, yeah, we're getting tired after so many days of the course, so no worries. Let's take a break, and then we're gonna talk about water allocation.
Okay, if it is fine for you, we can have a 5-minute break, and then you can continue.
Perfect.
Okay, see you in 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Cecilia.
Yeah, so I was wondering, in the beginning of the presentation, you briefly mentioned about environmental democracy. Could you please explain it a little?
Yeah, this is, well, environmental democracy is a field of political ecology dealing with the involvement of people in decision making about the environment. So yeah, I'm involved in several research projects related to participation in decision making. So for example, public consultations about extractive projects, or public audiences for the decision about infrastructure that is being built. So, you know, it deals with, it's a field of study that deals with the participation and involvement in decision making about the environment, water, natural resources in general. Are you at all familiar with any of those processes?
Oh, not really. Also,
Okay.
yeah, it's a very new term for me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, maybe in another opportunity, I'll be able to share some of those studies that are very interesting.
Okay, yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cecilia, if it is fine for you, we can go ahead with the next part.
Yes. Okay. So can you see my slide now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so now I would like to tell you a little bit more about water allocation, which is that very first source of information that I talked to you about when we talked about water metabolism. And so we're going to talk about an example as well for Colombia. And first, I would like to share some learning objectives. First, to understand the rationales and principles of water allocation, and to understand how inequality of water access and allocation can be reflected in an imperfect tool such as the Gini coefficient. So we're going to see an application of the Gini coefficient to water. And before we start, I would like to ask you, why do you think societies allocate water? Why is it necessary to allocate water? What do you think? Why would we allocate water? Any ideas based on your experience, what you live, what you experience in your countries, in your cities? Why do you think it is necessary to allocate water? Any ideas?
It's a finite resource.
Exactly. It is a finite resource, right? Mm-hmm. Why else?
Well, it'll be absolutely chaotic otherwise. I mean, it'll be very difficult to control. I mean, who's going to? I mean, it's also from the equality and equity perspective.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We want to have an equitable distribution, right? Otherwise, it would be very chaotic. Why else? Based on all that you have learned this week on the course.
And also to be able to control the regulate the misuse and overuse.
Misuse and abuse, exactly. Yeah. Why
To
else?
use water efficiently.
Exactly. That's a very important one. Efficiency. Okay, so great. There's also, oops, this is not working. There's competing uses for a limited resource, right? There's food production, there's energy, there's domestic, there's industry. Besides, you've seen all these days, there's more variability, there's climate change. And as you said, water also is has to be allocated according to some principles like efficiency. We want to use it well. We want it to go to those who need it most. So we cannot treat, societies have decided that we don't treat water as a commodity. Very few countries treat water as a commodity to sell it and trade it. We still, most societies in the planet consider water as a common good. So in that sense, there's a need to allocate it. So allocation is a very important tool to manage water. Also, you mentioned it, and we've seen it throughout the course. Scarcity is a growing concern in society. How do you think we define scarcity these days? How do we define water scarcity? How would you define water scarcity? Any ideas?
One sort of acceptable definition seems to be that of saying that, let's say in India, we have a standard of 150 liters per person per day. And we are not able to provide that. The presence of an informal market in the form of water tankers, private tube wells, also typically indicate that the system is not able to provision adequate water.
Exactly. So lack of sufficient available water resources to meet demand. And as Piyush just said, you know, we can say or the United Nations, like I think the figure you mentioned comes from the United Nations, says, you know, below this, there is water scarcity. Below this level, we are under water scarcity or water stress. So there is basically different components to water scarcity. One is the biophysical component, so low available water, for example, in dry regions, but there's also the human-induced scarcity that is associated with high demand from a specific economic sector. So inadequate, we can define water scarcity as the inadequate physical water resource or a poor management of available water resources. So how do we allocate water? Usually the permit system, or what we call in Colombia concessions, which are basically water rights, are given by a specified volume of water of a given source. So, you know, specified for a particular river, stream, groundwater, aquifer, or, you know, as a specific water source for a given time. So it's also time bound, and it's usually linked to the payment of fees. And there are multiple criteria that are used to allocate water. So there's the technical efficiency, there's the economic efficiency, there's equity, and there's also the criteria of sustainability. So what we have in Colombia is a system of water rights that we call concessions. I know it's not the best translation in English, but we'll use it for this presentation. And these concessions or water rights are granted by regional environmental authorities. There are 33 environmental authorities in Colombia distributed in the different states or departments. And the spatial variability or the spatial availability of water depends very much on precipitation. So we have in Colombia the Andean region with 2 wet seasons and 2 dry seasons. That is a bimodal distribution of precipitation, but we also have the plains, which is the case that I just showed you for the water metabolism, where we have a unimodal distribution of precipitation. So we see in the country significant variation of precipitation in terms of space. We also have, in terms of the principles of water allocation, we have a national code of renewable natural resources and protection of the environment, which is a very old law from 1974, which says that the environment is going to be managed according to criteria of equity, permanent availability, which is more or less sustainability, and maximum social participation, which is more or less related to equity. And the Water Code of 1978 says that domestic use will always have priority over other uses, collective uses over individual uses, and the needs of the local inhabitants of a region over those of outside. So the water will be used first inside a watershed before it gets transported elsewhere. So when we decided to do this study on water allocation, the data source we had was the collection or a database that was collected by the Colombian Institute of Hydrology, Meteorology, and Environmental Studies that put together this database with all the concessions, the beneficiaries of those concessions, the volume of water allocated, the type of use that was allowed, say for domestic, for agriculture, for industrial, for commercial use, for hydroelectricity generation. And this database was formed by more than 28,000 records. That is individual water concessions. During this period, we concentrated on this period because that's when the Institute collected the data. So each environmental authority reported active concessions to the Ministry of the Environment, and then the Institute put it together. We obtained this data source, this database under the Freedom of Information Act. More than 2 years. It took us more than 2 years to get this data because it wasn't publicly available. Just to stress that problem we have in developing countries with accessing data that should be publicly available. So with this database, we could run different analyses. So for example, well, we're gonna see that, but I want to stress before we move to the way we analyze the data, I want to stress that the database excludes more than 70% of small users of water that do not have a formal water concession because they haven't needed it. We are seeing that as climate variability increases, as water demand increases, people are trying to get their permits, their water concessions more, but still we see a very high percentage of water users without a water permit or water concession. So we ran several analyses. One was by concession, one was by grantee. So, you know, putting together all the volume allocated to one grantee or water user by type of use, that means by sector, economic sector. And we also did an analysis of the Gini. The Gini is a coefficient that is usually applied to income inequality. And I don't know if you're familiar with the way the Gini coefficient is calculated, but I'll explain it briefly. So in this graph, we have applied to water use. We have the cumulative water users, starting with the user that uses the less water, and you start adding all the water users according to how much water they receive, right? So you get a cumulative water users on the x-axis and cumulative water volume on the y-axis. The line of equality, that is, if everybody had exactly the same water allocated, would be this one, this 45-degree line of equality. And then in that case, the Gini coefficient would be 0 because the area under A would be 0. And then the most unequal distribution would be if the Lorentz curve is very flat here and then very steep here, with a Gini tending to become 1. So the highest the Gini, the highest the inequality. So let's look at how we did this analysis. So the first thing we saw, was how the water was allocated between different sectors. We noted that in terms of the number of water rights, 58% of the water rights or concessions are concentrated in agriculture, but also the same percentage of the volume is allocated to the agricultural sector. Interestingly, less than 1% of the water rights or concessions are allocated to hydroelectricity, but about 21% of the water is allocated to hydroelectricity. So let's look at the agricultural water allocation. And this is one first approximation to inequality in water allocation. We see here that 48% of concessions have less than 100 cubic meters per year, which are these two bars here. But they amount to only 1.2% of the water allocation. In contrast with 1% of of concessions that account for 49% of the water allocated to agriculture. So this is an initial indicator of inequality in water allocation in the agricultural sector for the country as a whole. If we look at regional distribution of concessions, we get a very interesting distribution, because we get that only 3 of the environmental authorities concentrate 43% of the water allocated in Colombia, reflecting the concentration of water in intensive agriculture. These are the regions where concentrate rice and sugarcane production. This is another way of looking at exactly the same data. If we compare water allocated in cubic meters per year in relation to irrigated land in each department, we see that these 3 departments, Huila, Tolima, and Valle, use 2 to 3 times more water per unit of irrigated land than the second group of departments with significant agricultural water users. The other thing we noted here is that in this region, in these 3 regions, agricultural concessions exceed demand by 100%. So that means that if we calculate water use based on the area irrigated and the crop water requirements, we get that the water allocated is double that amount, at least double that amount. So, you know, it makes you think about the criteria of efficiency. Yeah, in terms of individual concessions, we notice that agriculture is the two biggest water users are two irrigation districts with 100% of the water that is allocated to for agriculture. 6 of the top 10 grantees of water are hydropower. And also we include this huge domestic water provider for the city of Medellin. In terms of domestic water allocation, and also in relation to Piyush's comment just previously, we notice that there's also a very unequal distribution in domestic water. The water allocated for domestic use per person ranges between 0.1 cubic meters per person allocated by the CDA, which is located or has jurisdiction over the northeast of the Colombian Amazon region, over here, and 243 cubic meters per person allocated in Huila. So there's a huge range. The UN recommendation is 50 liters per person per day, which is about 18 cubic meters per person per year. So it would be even lower than the range that I highlighted here, which is the recommended rural water supply in Colombia, which is between 30 and 88 cubic meters per person per year. In rural and peri-urban areas, it is important to have in mind that there is multiple uses of water because of small-scale agriculture, and also because these regions are usually characterized by losses in the distribution system. So that's why we see that higher range of water allocation in peri-urban and rural areas. Let's move into hydro generation. How do we allocate water to hydropower? There are two components of water allocation for hydro. There's the non-consumptive water use for hydro, which is the water required to turn the turbines and, you know, generate the electricity, but it's usually water that comes back to the stream. And there's the consumptive use of water, which is the evaporative losses of water from reservoirs, because usually, you know, there's the need to build these massive dams to store water in order to generate the electricity. So there's that component of the consumptive use of water. So if we look at how we allocate water in Colombia, we see that there doesn't seem to be any relation to either consumptive or non-consumptive use of water. If we try to see if there's any relation between the generation capacity in the different regions where there is hydro electricity capacity, we see that there's no consistency between generation capacity and water allocated. We see, for example, cases like Boyacá and Córdoba, where there is hydroelectricity capacity, but there's no allocation of water. So you wonder why environmental authorities are not granting water. If we compare the average non-consumptive water required per megawatt of energy produced based on data for the US, we get about this line. You know, we need about 15 million cubic meters of water to flow to generate 1 megawatt of energy. And we see that there's no relationship whatsoever to that non-consumptive need for water for electricity generation. Some departments have underreporting, or they are allocating negligible amounts relative to their requirements, or other departments like Quindío and Risaralda are allocating huge amounts that have no relation to the actual requirement. So the other thing that is interesting here is that the volume of hydro concessions are not tied to fees for hydro, because hydroelectricity corporations, they pay a fee that is related to gross income, but not to the water use. Another very interesting insight into this allocation is here where you see these red arrows is hydro dams that are linked to socio-environmental conflicts. And these 6 departments are have been reported in the Environmental Justice Atlas that I mentioned previously. So it is unclear how or with what criteria water is being allocated to hydro. There doesn't seem to be any unified criteria across the country to allocate water for this particular activity. Let's look at the results of the Gini coefficient applied to water. So taking the overall database, we get a Gini coefficient of 0.92. If we bring together water rights under the same concession holder, say because one concession holder has more than one water right, then the water Gini goes up a little bit to 0.94. If we only take the agricultural water Gini, it goes down a little bit to 0.86. And if we group agricultural beneficiaries of water rights, then it goes up again to 0.90. And that is logical, because when we group together water users that have more than one concession, that means that water is concentrated. It's being concentrated on a few users. Graphically, what I just told you in the previous slide would look like this. So we have the dotted blue line, the water Gini by concession holder, and the dotted green line, the agricultural water Gini by concession. Sorry, the dotted red line, the agricultural water Gini by concession holder. So, you know, there's this difference between the agricultural water Gini by concession holder and the agricultural water Gini by concession. So there's a few departments where, well, actually more than a few departments where the agricultural water Gini by concession holder is higher, because they split the concessions, or the same user has water concessions over more than one source. Another comparison we did was that one between land versus the water Gini. So what land inequality in Colombia has historically been very high and recognized as the second highest in Latin America. We have a land Gini of 0.86. So if we compare the agricultural water Gini by concession holder with the land Gini by property owner, this is what we get. So Colombia has the second highest in Latin America, second highest land Gini after Paraguay. And if we consider the land Gini by property owner versus the agricultural Gini by concession holder, 56% of the departments have concentration of water higher than the concentration of land. So, you know, there's this huge concern about the inequality in the distribution of water. We base this on the 3.7 million parcels and 16,000 agricultural water concessions. And we consider that more than 70% of small users have no formal formal water right. So as a summary, we have the water allocation in Colombia is extremely unequal. In some regions, it's more unequally distributed than land. The rationale for water allocation doesn't seem to be clear. Water allocation is not associated with the needs for hydropower generation, for domestic use, or for agricultural use. The criteria used for allocation are not consistent across the country or transparent. And we wonder whether these criteria are useful for water management. And we also see that the principles of water allocation in the water code are not fully implemented. We think that in order for concessions to be an instrument of equity and sustainability, decisions should be made differently. There should be a transparent and a standardized allocation criteria. The corporate entities should are accumulating water rights, and this should be transparent, because right now we don't really know. It's very difficult to know how much water is being concentrated by corporations. We think that there should be a centralized database, because that would be a very valuable tool for monitoring how water allocation decisions are being made. The information on these concessions should be public. Also on the way the process of the concession, the granting of concession should be public, so that decisions can be challenged by the people, and there can be an improved process of allocation. And we also think that concessions should be granted considering seasonal variability, because clearly there's no consideration of variability in water availability when decisions about allocation are being made. And if you're interested in more details about this, these results were published in the journal Local Environment in 2015. So yeah, I would be very happy to hear your reflections, your comment, your questions regarding water allocation.
Okay, thank you so much for this interesting presentation. There is a really long comment in the chat. So I don't know if you have access to the chat tool, or it's
yeah, I see it. Chiranjeevi, would you like to ask your question online? Would you like to tell us your question or your comment? It would be great to hear you and see you.
Well, this is Chiranjeevi from Uganda. Thank you for a nice presentation. But my concern here, I'm next to Nile River and the Victoria Lake here in Uganda, and I'm looking this perspective in the, you know, that this crossing multi-country big Nile River, and where I visited in the like the bank of the Nile River, well, the community they depend on fishing community and lot of, you know, these local people they depend on the water resource with the Nile. And they do not involve in this all the politics governance system, and they are using the resource there. Only we see the news that Al Jazeera, BBC, that Ethiopian dam, Uganda dam hydro project, and from the Egypt they comment it, you know, this geopolitics from the region. So so those people who my concern here in the micro level, those people who are depending on their livelihood with this big water resource, they don't know the water allocation, governance, and equity of the use of water. So how the science and then this geopolitics play on the micro level gap allocation use, whatever term we use. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a very tough one. The thing is, with increasing scarcity and more competition, there are some legitimate authorities that are making decisions on who is going to use water, right? And especially in very big rivers such as the Nile, there is even more complexity because there are several institutional governments that are making decisions on their own. So the upper watershed, in the upper watershed, people have more or can make decisions that are impacting downstream, right? But with water in scarcity, with increasing pressures on water resources, there's an increasing need to get involved in how decisions are being made. So I totally agree with you that most local users are not involved, they're not interested, they're just using the water as it comes, right? But as the conflicts increase, there's this need to say, okay, let us participate, let us know how decisions are being made, because we want to be involved and we don't want to be affected. I don't know if you see in your region any initiative in that sense, moving towards that involvement.
Just a compliment that last year we tried to implement a groundwater project, and it impacted that because of the Nile Treaty, like where is the water table, how it discharges, and blah blah. It's issue came there. So now I realize this, you know, all the politics leading in the water governance, but not focusing on the micro level water use.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, there's different levels, different levels of authority. You mentioned the big basin governance of the Nile, right? But at the local scale, you mentioned there's that piece missing.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, we see that we see that here too, right? Even at the national scale, we get the national water study every few years, but decisions at the watershed scale are done in councils, in watershed councils, also where the small water users don't have access, don't participate, they're not involved because they're considered not very important actors.
Okay, there's a question from Anu. If you want, could you please submit directly the question to Cecilia, please?
Yeah, Anu, go ahead.
Hi, Cecilia. I'm again reflecting, what does it mean now for the theme? Like this one of the catch, how do you say, the focus theme of this course is about post-pandemic recovery, right? Some of the the case narrative that you have presented, I assume it's pre-COVID, right? There is where the whole intensifications of water extractions and resource and competition is the scenario. But now with the COVID and people are becoming more mindful about equity and, being love thy neighbor kind of a thing, would this whole discourse on water metabolism and water allocation change? Or would they go back to business as usual? And how should we read this as, when we link with our course?
Yeah, I don't know what your experience has been in your country, but what we saw with the outbreak of the pandemic was that, for example, in cities, the government said, we're going to reconnect those people that have been disconnected from water service because of lack of payment. So with COVID, what we realized is that there were lots of people that were not connected to the water system because of lack of payment, because of poverty. So not even the basic water supply for the human right to water was being met. And that came up, like a week into the first week of this social isolation. The government came up with this reconnection of those unconnected. So it generated this public debate of what is happening. The pandemic arrives and there's 2 million people in Colombia without access to water because they don't have enough money to pay the water bill. So with the pandemic and the need to wash your hands all the time, then this initiative got implemented in several cities. But the big question remains is if this is going to stay, after the main waves of the pandemic fade. So I think it's a very good question. It's a very interesting question, and it will depend very much on the pressure of communities to keep the water flowing for the human right to water.
But Cecilia, just to add on to it, because when you mention about suddenly the pandemic really exposed some of the the major loopholes, or because it seems if 2 million of the population did not even have the basic the human rights related water consumption means this whole debate or findings that you talked about in the relation to water allocation, this will have to be revised, right? Because this section of the population were not even counted as what within the framing of the water allocations, right? Because whether it's for the domestic consumptions or economic, there are still some certain section of the population that will have to use water, right? And if this section is not being even accounted, and that pandemic had revealed, means the whole water allocation discourse might change drastically now, right? With this missing gap or missing, data or community suddenly sprouting after COVID.
Actually, the people who were disconnected from the water services were in the major cities. and they were not receiving the service because they hadn't been able to pay the water bill. And I think for this, well, I'm sure that for all these major cities, water allocation has been provided to the water providers, to major water providers in the cities, either public or private water service providers. So the allocation for domestic has been done. It is done. It is, the water is allocated, but the system, the way it is structured in fees, so that people have to pay fees, makes it inaccessible for the poor. So that's what needs to change. The allocation and the allocation system in that case is working, because there is the water allocation for these domestic water distributors. What is not working is the actual implementation of the human right to water, because there is this scheme of payment for the distribution. Not necessarily for the water, but for the service, for the distribution service. So I think that in that sense, that's what needs to change, not necessarily the water allocation. The water allocation, and even in the law, says, domestic use has priority over other uses. So that would be easily defendable. But it is the practical application or the practical implementation of the human right to water that doesn't really happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions or reflections on water allocation? Well, I think that's it, Danilo.
I guess that a week of IPROMO course is leaving the mark on participant energy for sure. And okay, I invite you again, as Cecilia, to submit your questions or comments now, or if you agree, if somebody needs more time to elaborate the question, if you can then share your contacts, or they can submit the question to me, and then I'll forward to you.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Professor Roa Garcia very much for this very interesting and lively session of this zooming in IPROMO course. And I invite everybody to open the microphone and the camera to say thank you so much to Cecilia. And okay, for today we are concluding the session, and I invite you for tomorrow for the last day of IPROMO course. So thank you, Cecilia. Thank you very much. Thank you again, and see you tomorrow. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have
a nice evening.
Bye bye.
Ciao.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Bye, Vanessa again.